September 14th, 1944. Late afternoon light stretched across a quiet French valley, the kind of place where nothing seemed urgent, nothing seemed dangerous. Fields rolled gently between low stone fences, patches of crops standing tall, and a narrow dirt path cutting through the open ground like a guide for anyone moving forward. It looked harmless, predictable, safe. That illusion is exactly what 80 German infantrymen were relying on. By this stage of the war, German units retreating through France had learned a simple, practical rule about American rifle fire. At distances beyond roughly 300 yards, the odds of being hit dropped sharply. Not impossible, but unlikely enough to take calculated risks. Ammunition was limited, visibility was inconsistent, and most soldiers simply weren't trained to hit individual targets at extreme range. So they adapted. They moved fast when they had to, they took cover when it was obvious, but when crossing wide, open ground beyond that invisible 300-yard line, they often stayed upright, walking, not crawling, saving time, saving energy, trusting distance as protection. And on this afternoon, distance looked like their ally. Across the valley, hidden among low earth and grass, one American soldier watched them. Corporal Daniel Keller wasn't in a fortified bunker. He wasn't surrounded by a full squad. He wasn't even positioned where doctrine would have recommended. He was simply in the right place at the right time with a very unusual kind of experience. From his position, the Germans were clearly visible, not rushing, not scattered, moving in a loose formation, confident enough to stay on their feet. They believed they were too far away to be engaged effectively. They were wrong, but not in a way they could have anticipated. Because the distance between them and Keller wasn't just a number, it was a test. A very specific kind of test that Keller had been unknowingly preparing for most of his life. Long before France, before the Army, before the war, Keller had spent years in rural Pennsylvania, not as a soldier, but as a farm boy with a rifle. His targets weren't human, they were woodchucks, small, cautious animals, rarely giving you a second chance to shoot. A woodchuck standing upright presents a target roughly 6 inches wide, and they don't let you get close. To hit one consistently, you had to learn distance in a way most people never did, not just estimating it, but feeling it, understanding how a bullet behaves over hundreds of yards, how it drops, how wind nudges it off course, how even the smallest miscalculation turns a clean shot into a miss. Keller had spent over a decade doing exactly that. 500 yards wasn't unusual for him, it was normal. So when he looked out across that French valley and saw German soldiers at distances between 400 and 600 yards, he didn't see too far. He saw something else entirely. He saw familiar ground. Back in the valley, the Germans continued forward. There was no sign they had been detected, no incoming fire, no urgency, just steady movement across open terrain. From their perspective, everything made sense. From Keller's perspective, everything had just changed. He studied them carefully. Distance first, always distance. The farthest men were pushing towards 600 yards, the closer ones maybe just under 400. Wind was light, but not non-existent, enough to matter, always enough to matter. There was no rangefinder, no advanced optics, just experience, memory, instinct built from repetition. He adjusted his position slightly, settling into the ground, minimizing movement. At these distances, even small errors multiply. Breathing becomes a factor, timing becomes a factor, everything becomes a factor. The Germans were still walking, still exposed, still convinced they were safe. Keller picked a target, not randomly, but deliberately. One soldier, slightly separated from the others, clear line of sight, minimal interference, the kind of shot he had taken hundreds of times before, just in a different setting. He exhaled slowly. At this distance, there's a delay. You don't just fire and see the result instantly. There's a gap, a fraction of a second where the bullet is traveling, dropping, adjusting to the invisible forces acting on it. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked across the valley. To the Germans, it would have sounded distant, uncertain, not immediately threatening. At 500 yards, sound doesn't always tell you where danger is coming from. It echoes, it blends into the environment. And for a brief moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then one man dropped. Not dramatically, not with chaos, just a sudden collapse, as if his legs had given out beneath him. The others paused. Confusion, not panic. They looked around, trying to understand what they had just seen. A fall? A misstep? Maybe a stray shot from somewhere far off, not accurate enough to matter. Because according to everything they believed, it couldn't be what it actually was. A deliberate, precise shot from beyond the distance they considered dangerous. Keller didn't rush. That was another lesson from years of hunting. One shot doesn't define anything. It's the follow-up, the consistency, the ability to repeat under pressure. He adjusted again, slight correction, slight shift, the kind of movement almost invisible from a distance but critical for accuracy. Another target, another breath, another shot. Again the delay. Again confusion in the valley. This time the reaction was sharper, heads turned more quickly, bodies shifted. The idea of safety at distance was starting to crack, but not yet break. They still didn't understand. And that misunderstanding was the most dangerous part, because as long as they believed distance was protecting them, they would remain exposed. And as long as they remained exposed, Keller could keep shooting. What was happening in that moment wasn't just a man firing a rifle, it was a collision between two completely different understandings of distance, one built on standard military training, the other built on years of precise, repetitive, almost obsessive practice. One assumed limits, the other ignored them. And in the quiet of that French valley, with the light beginning to fade and the ground offering no cover, that difference was about to turn into something far more serious than confusion. It was about to stop and advance. For most soldiers in 1944, long-range shooting was a specialized skill, something taught in controlled conditions, practiced occasionally, and rarely trusted in the chaos of real combat. Hitting a man-sized target beyond 300 yards wasn't impossible, but it wasn't something you relied on, not consistently, not under pressure. But Daniel Keller didn't learn to shoot that way. He didn't learn it on a range with instructors calling out distances and corrections. He didn't learn it with standardized targets or predictable conditions. He learned it alone in open fields where every shot mattered and every mistake meant failure. Years before the war, in rural Pennsylvania, Keller spent countless hours hunting woodchucks. It wasn't a hobby in the casual sense. It was routine, a part of life on farmland where these animals could damage crops and undermine soil. Farmers didn't just tolerate them, they dealt with them. And dealing with them wasn't easy. A woodchuck doesn't give you clean opportunities. It doesn't stand still in the open for long. It watches. It listens. The moment something feels wrong, it disappears into the ground. If you miss, you don't get a second shot. You get nothing. That changes how you shoot. You don't fire quickly. You don't guess. You don't rely on luck. You slow down. You study. You wait for the exact moment when everything aligns, the position, the distance, the wind, the timing. And most importantly, you learn distance. Not just in numbers, but in instinct. Because out in those fields, distances aren't marked. There are no signs telling you 300 yards or 500 yards. You have to look at the land itself, the slope of the ground, the spacing of fences, the size of objects, and make a decision. And that decision determines everything that comes next. If you're off by even a small margin, you miss. So over time, Keller adapted.
He learned how far a bullet would drop at different ranges, how wind, even when barely noticeable, could push a shot off target, how light and shadow could distort perception, how to control his breathing so that the rifle moved as little as possible at the exact moment he pulled the trigger. And he repeated this process again and again, not for days, not for weeks, for years. 14 years of shooting at targets no wider than 6 inches, often at distances of 400, 500, even beyond. 14 years of making adjustments without thinking about them consciously, of building a kind of automatic precision that didn't rely on calculation in the moment, it relied on memory. By the time he joined the Army, Keller wasn't just a good shot, he was something else entirely. But the military didn't fully recognize that, because on paper, his skill didn't look extraordinary. He didn't have advanced equipment. He didn't come from a sniper school. He didn't carry a specialized rifle designed for extreme distances. He was just another infantryman with standard gear, trained under the same assumptions as everyone else. Assumptions that said 300 yards was the practical limit. So when Keller found himself in France, those assumptions followed him, but they didn't define him. Back in the valley, the situation was unfolding in a way no training manual had prepared for. The Germans were still trying to make sense of what was happening. A second man had fallen. Now there was no denying it. Something was wrong. But the explanation wasn't obvious. There was no visible enemy, no concentrated fire, no clear direction. Just isolated shots, spaced apart, each one followed by another man dropping. At that distance, it didn't feel like an immediate threat. It felt distant, almost disconnected, like danger that hadn't quite reached them yet. And that hesitation, those few seconds of uncertainty, gave Keller exactly what he needed: time. He shifted slightly again, adjusting his position in the grass. The ground beneath him was uneven, but he compensated without thinking. His body settled naturally into a stable posture, one he had used countless times before. Another target came into focus. This one was moving slightly faster, beginning to angle away as if sensing something was off. That made the shot more difficult. Movement always complicates distance. Timing becomes tighter. The margin for error shrinks. But Keller had dealt with that too. He tracked the movement, not rushing, letting the rhythm settle, the same way he would track an animal that might vanish at any second. He inhaled, paused, then slowly exhaled as he applied pressure to the trigger. The shot broke clean. Again, that brief silence after the sound, that fraction of time where nothing is certain. Then the result. Another man fell. This time, the reaction in the valley shifted. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was awareness. Something deliberate was happening, something precise. But still, the distance worked against them, because to return effective fire, they needed to identify where the shots were coming from. And at 500 yards, with a single shooter carefully concealed, that's not easy. Sound doesn't point clearly. Movement is minimal. There's no muzzle flash visible in daylight from that far away. Keller understood this advantage instinctively. Back in Pennsylvania, if you revealed your position too obviously, the hunt was over. The animal would disappear, and you'd lose your opportunity. So you stayed still. You blended into the environment. You became part of the background. Now in France, that same principle applied, but the stakes were infinitely higher. He wasn't just trying to avoid being seen. He was controlling the entire engagement. Every shot was spaced, deliberate, never rushed. He wasn't firing as fast as he could. He was firing as accurately as he needed to. Because speed creates mistakes, and mistakes at these distances mean misses. The Germans began to react more aggressively now. Some started to lower themselves, instinctively seeking cover where there was almost none. Others looked towards the edges of the valley, scanning for movement, trying to locate a threat that didn't behave the way they expected. They were trained for firefights. This wasn't a firefight. This was something else, something slower, something more precise, and far more difficult to understand. Keller selected another target, adjusting slightly for distance. This one was farther out, closer to the upper range of what most soldiers would even attempt, but to him it was still within reach, because he had done it before, not once, not twice, hundreds of times. He steadied the rifle, letting everything settle into alignment. The world narrowed down to a single point. Distance, wind, movement, everything accounted for in a way that didn't require conscious thought. He fired, and once again the valley answered with silence, followed by another body hitting the ground. At that moment, the pattern was becoming undeniable. This wasn't random, this wasn't luck, this was skill. A level of skill the Germans hadn't planned for, hadn't trained for, and didn't believe was possible at this distance. And the most dangerous part, they still didn't understand it. Because if they had, they would have done the one thing that might have saved them. They would have stopped moving in the open. But they didn't. Not yet. And as long as they stayed exposed, Keller's years of quiet practice in distant American fields were about to keep turning into something far more lethal on a battlefield thousands of miles away.
By now, something had clearly gone wrong in the valley. 3 men were down, not wounded in a chaotic exchange, not caught in crossfire, dropped cleanly, one after another, at distances where they were supposed to be safe. The German column slowed, then hesitated. Movement lost its rhythm. Heads turned in different directions, searching for a threat that didn't behave the way threats were supposed to. Because according to everything they had been taught, this didn't make sense. Rifle fire at this range wasn't supposed to be accurate. It wasn't supposed to be consistent. A lucky shot, maybe. 2, unlikely. But this was something else. And that gap between expectation and reality, that was where the real danger lived. From his position, Keller could see the change happening, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a slight break in formation, the beginning of doubt, but not yet panic. They still hadn't found him, and as long as they didn't know where the shots were coming from, they couldn't respond effectively. They couldn't return fire, they couldn't suppress, they couldn't even move with confidence. They were exposed, but more importantly, they were uncertain. Keller understood that uncertainty instinctively. Back home, when an animal sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify the source, it hesitated. It didn't run immediately. It paused, trying to confirm the danger. And in that pause, if you were ready, you got another shot. That same moment was happening here, just on a larger scale. He shifted his focus to a new target. This one had begun to lower himself slightly, not fully taking cover, but no longer walking upright with the same confidence. It made the shot more complicated, less of a clean silhouette, more angles, more variables. At these distances, small changes matter. Keller adjusted his aim, not just for distance, but for posture. The target wasn't presenting a full profile anymore. That meant a smaller margin for error, the kind of shot most soldiers wouldn't take. But Keller didn't see it that way. To him, it was still manageable. He slowed his breathing, letting the movement of the rifle settle into a natural rhythm. Inhale, exhale, pause. The world narrowed again, reducing everything down to alignment and timing. He fired. The sound cracked across the valley, echoing off the low hills. And once again, there was that delay, the fraction of a second where nothing happened. Then the result. The man dropped. This time, the reaction was immediate. No more hesitation, no more uncertainty about whether something was happening. The column began to break apart, not into organized defensive positions, but into scattered, instinctive movements. Some men dropped to the ground, others tried to move faster, angling toward what little cover they could see. But the terrain offered almost nothing. That was the mistake. The valley looked open because it was open. Low grass, gentle slopes, a few fences, but nothing that could stop a bullet, nothing that could hide a man properly at these distances. It wasn't just exposed, it was unforgiving. And now, for the first time, the Germans were starting to realize it.
But realization didn't solve their problem, because they still didn't know where Keller was. From 400 to 600 yards away, a single prone shooter is almost invisible if he doesn't move. No muzzle flash to give him away in daylight, no obvious sound direction, just isolated shots, each one separated by enough time to prevent easy tracking. Keller maintained that rhythm deliberately. He didn't rush after the fourth shot or the fifth. He let the moment breathe, even as the Germans scrambled, because rushing would only increase the chance of a miss, and a miss would break the pattern, and the pattern was everything. As long as every shot resulted in a hit, the psychological pressure would keep building. Confusion would turn into fear, fear would turn into disorganization, and disorganization in the open is deadly. He selected another target. This one was moving faster now, half-crouched, trying to reach a slight dip in the ground that might offer some protection. It wasn't much, but it was something. That made the shot harder, not just because of the movement, but because of the timing. If the man reached that low ground, even minimal cover could make him significantly harder to hit. The window was closing. Keller tracked him carefully. No sudden movements, no rushed corrections, just smooth, controlled adjustment, keeping the rifle aligned as the target moved across the field. He waited for the right moment, not when the man was moving fastest, but when his motion stabilized for just a fraction of a second, a tiny hesitation that most people wouldn't even notice. Keller noticed it. He fired. Again the delay, again the result. The man collapsed just short of the shallow dip he had been running toward. Now the reaction in the valley shifted from confusion to something more intense. Men were dropping fully to the ground. Some tried to crawl. Others looked back the way they had come, as if retreat might be safer than continuing forward. Orders were likely being shouted, but at this distance, Keller couldn't hear them clearly. He didn't need to. He could see the effect. The advance had stopped. Not because of heavy fire, not because of overwhelming force, but because one man, at a distance they believed was safe, was breaking their assumptions shot by shot. Keller adjusted again, shifting slightly to maintain his angle as the formation dissolved. Targets were no longer neatly spaced. They were scattered, irregular, harder to pick out cleanly, but still visible, still within range, and still vulnerable. He took another breath, lining up his next shot as the light began to shift slightly across the valley. This wasn't over, not even close, because now that the first impossible shots had proven themselves real, the engagement had changed completely, and the man controlling that change was still unseen, still patient, and still operating at a level the enemy hadn't prepared for.
Time passed differently in the valley now. What had started as a steady advance had turned into something fragmented, almost frozen in place. The Germans were no longer moving with purpose. They were reacting, dropping, crawling, stopping, looking for direction that wasn't coming fast enough. And every few moments, another shot cut through the air. Then silence. Then another man fell. Keller had settled into a rhythm. Not a rushed rhythm, not driven by urgency, but by control. Each movement had a purpose. Each shot followed the same sequence: observe, measure, adjust, fire. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary risk. He wasn't thinking about numbers. Not yet. He was thinking about consistency. Because consistency is what turns skill into dominance. The rifle rested firmly against his shoulder, the ground supporting his position just enough to keep him stable without forcing him into discomfort. Small adjustments came naturally now. A slight shift of the elbow, a minor change in angle, the kind of corrections that happen without conscious thought after years of repetition. In the valley, the Germans were trying to adapt. Some had flattened themselves completely against the earth, hoping that reducing their profile would make them harder to hit. Others attempted short bursts of movement, crawling toward fences, shallow dips, anything that might break the line of sight. But the terrain wasn't built for survival under precision fire. It offered the illusion of safety without the reality of it. At these distances, even a prone figure is still visible if you know what to look for. A slight change in color, a movement against the grain of the grass, a shape that doesn't belong. Keller knew exactly what to look for. He picked out another target, this one barely moving, trying to stay completely still. For most shooters, that might make the shot easier, but at long range, stillness can be deceptive. Without movement, judging exact position becomes more difficult. Depth perception flattens, details blur. Keller took an extra moment. He studied the position, confirming the outline, making sure he wasn't rushing into a mistake. One wrong shot could break the pattern he had established, could give the Germans a sense that the threat was less precise than it actually was. He didn't let that happen. He adjusted slightly for distance, accounting for the subtle drop he knew the bullet would take. The wind hadn't changed much, but even a small shift mattered. He exhaled slowly and fired. The shot echoed, the delay, then the confirmation. Even a motionless target wasn't safe. Back in the valley, that realization spread faster than any command could. It wasn't just movement that was dangerous anymore. It was exposure itself. Simply being there, in that open ground, within that invisible range, had become a threat. And there was no clear way out. Some of the Germans began pulling back, retracing their steps, trying to put distance between themselves and whatever was hitting them. Others stayed down, hoping that staying low would be enough. But the lack of coordination made everything worse. They weren't acting as a unit anymore. They were acting as individuals. And individuals in open terrain under accurate fire are easier to pick apart. Keller noticed the shift immediately. Targets were no longer clustered. They were scattered, unpredictable, some moving, some still, some partially hidden behind shallow features that offered just enough obstruction to complicate the shot. It forced him to adapt as well. No more easy silhouettes. Now every shot required more time, more focus. But Keller had time. That was the advantage he held over everyone in that valley. He wasn't being rushed. He wasn't under direct threat. No bullets were coming back at him. No one was suppressing his position. The distance that protected the Germans from most rifle fire was now protecting him from theirs. And he used that advantage fully. Another target appeared, this one attempting to crawl along a fence line. The posts created a pattern, a visual reference that could either help or interfere depending on how you used it. Keller used it. He aligned the shot, using the spacing of the posts to gauge distance and movement. The target paused briefly, adjusting his position. That was enough. Keller fired. Another hit. The fence offered no protection. Minutes continued to pass. 5 shots, 10, 15. Each one deliberate. Each one counted. The Germans were no longer advancing at all now. The valley had become a trap, not because it was surrounded, not because it was heavily defended, but because it exposed anyone inside it to a level of precision they hadn't prepared for. Attempts to organize a response kept failing. Without knowing the shooter's position, any coordinated movement risked drawing more fire. Standing up to run made you visible. Crawling slowed you down and still left you exposed over time. Staying still only delayed the inevitable if you had already been seen. There was no good option. And that realization, slow, creeping, unavoidable, was breaking whatever structure remained in the unit. Keller continued. He didn't speed up, even as opportunities presented themselves. That was the discipline, the restraint,
the understanding that accuracy mattered more than volume. He took another shot, then another. The count kept rising, though he wasn't keeping track consciously. What mattered was the effect. The valley had gone from movement to stillness, from confidence to hesitation, from control to collapse. At some point, the shooting stopped feeling like a series of individual engagements and started feeling like a continuous action, one extended moment stretched across hours. 3 hours. That's how long it lasted. 3 hours of controlled fire, of measured shots, of a single rifle dictating the pace of an entire battlefield situation. By the end of it, 34 men were down. Not from artillery, not from machine guns, not from a coordinated assault. From one position, one shooter, using a method that wasn't supposed to work at this scale, at these distances, under these conditions, and yet it had. The valley was quiet now. Not completely silent, but the kind of quiet that follows something decisive. Movement had stopped. The remaining Germans had either withdrawn beyond effective range or stayed low enough to avoid further exposure. The advance was over. Not delayed, stopped. Keller remained in position for a moment longer, scanning, confirming that no new movement threatened to restart what had just ended. There was no dramatic finish, no final charge, no clear signal marking the end. Just the absence of movement where there had once been 80 men crossing open ground. And the understanding, settling in slowly, that what had happened there wasn't just effective shooting. It was something far more disruptive. Because it had taken a basic assumption, distance equals safety, and proven it completely wrong.
The valley didn't change, but everything about it felt different now. Hours earlier, it had looked like open ground, a simple crossing point, a place where distance created safety and movement created progress. Now it looked exposed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every stretch of grass, every shallow dip, every fence line seemed insufficient, almost meaningless against what had just happened. The surviving Germans didn't need orders to understand it. They had felt it, not as a single overwhelming attack, but as something slower, more precise, and far more unsettling. Shots that came from too far away, impacts that didn't match expectation, men dropping without warning, without clear direction, without a visible enemy. And the most dangerous part wasn't just the casualties, it was the uncertainty that remained. Because even after it was over, they couldn't fully explain it. They could estimate the distance, they could guess the direction, but the idea that one rifleman had controlled that entire engagement from beyond what they believed was effective range, that didn't fit into the framework they had been trained to trust. So the valley stayed quiet. No renewed advance, no attempt to push forward through the same ground. Whatever momentum had existed before was gone, replaced by caution that hadn't been there at the start. From Keller's position, the change was just as clear. He remained still for a while, not out of hesitation, but out of habit. You don't stand up immediately after something like that. You observe, you confirm, you make sure the situation has truly settled. Only when the absence of movement became consistent did he allow himself to relax slightly. The rifle stayed in his hands, but the tension shifted. What had just happened didn't feel dramatic in the moment. There was no single turning point, no instant where everything changed at once. It had been gradual, shot by shot, adjustment by adjustment. That's how it worked, and that's what made it so effective, because there was no clear signal for the enemy to react to, no sudden overwhelming force that triggered an immediate coordinated response,
just a steady erosion of confidence, of structure, of movement, until nothing was left to continue the advance. Keller hadn't set out to stop 80 men. He had simply applied what he knew: distance, patience, precision, the same principles that had guided him in quiet fields years earlier, when the stakes were measured in missed shots instead of lives, the same habits built over thousands of repetitions long before he ever imagined they would matter in a place like this. And yet, in this moment, they had mattered more than anything else, because the battlefield isn't just shaped by numbers or firepower, it's shaped by what each side believes is possible. The Germans believed they were safe beyond 300 yards. That belief shaped their movement, their decisions, their willingness to cross open ground without cover. And once that belief was broken, everything else followed. Not instantly, but inevitably. They slowed, they hesitated, they separated, they lost coordination, and in open terrain without clear direction, that kind of breakdown spreads quickly. Keller didn't need to outnumber them. He didn't need superior equipment. He only needed to operate outside their expectations. That was the difference. As the light continued to fade over the valley, the physical evidence of what had happened remained scattered across the ground, but the more important impact wasn't something you could see. It was the shift in understanding. Because after that day, distance couldn't be trusted the same way again, not completely, not without doubt. And doubt changes behavior. It slows advances. It forces caution. It makes soldiers think twice about exposure, even when doctrine says it's acceptable. In that sense, what happened in the valley didn't end when the shooting stopped. It carried forward. Not as a widely recorded event, not as something that reshaped official strategy overnight, but as a quiet reminder of what one single individual could do when skill, experience, and circumstance aligned perfectly. Keller's role in it wouldn't be defined by rank or recognition. There were no large-scale maneuvers tied to his name, no major offensives planned around his actions, just a single engagement in a single makan where one soldier applied a lifetime of practice in a way that disrupted something much larger than himself. And maybe that's what makes it stand out. Not the scale of the battle, but the contrast. 80 men moving with confidence, supported by doctrine, by experience, by numbers, and one man, alone, relying on something far quieter, something built long before the war, in conditions that had nothing to do with combat, and yet prepared him for it more effectively than anyone could have predicted. The valley returned to stillness, but it wasn't the same stillness as before. Before, it had been calm because nothing had happened. Now, it was calm because something had ended. And somewhere in that silence was the lasting lesson of the day, simple but difficult to ignore. Distance doesn't guarantee safety, and sometimes the most decisive factor on a battlefield isn't how many people are present, but what one of them is truly capable of.